Privileged to have with us today Ian Hamilton, a popular author of 20 mystery novels. He began his writing career at 63, and it sounds like he's had a varied career before that. I guess the inspiration is also that it's never too late to start something new. So he's speaking about his journey as a writer and the lessons he's learned in the process.
Good morning, everyone. Hope the weather down there is as nice as it is here. I'm in Burlington, Ontario, by the way. I started writing when I was 63. Although my first career out of school was as a journalist, so I worked as a journalist for 5 years. Then I joined the federal government and held various positions there. I then went into business. And I was still in business in 2009 when, and not writing. I wasn't writing anything. I was simply running a business when I had a medical issue. It was an aneurysm. And I ended up at St. Michael's Hospital here in Toronto for like 6 or 7 hours of surgery to fix it. And on the way from the recovery room back to my room, the orderly who was pushing me said, your room's in the old wing of the hospital, and if you see any nuns, don't talk to them. And I said, why wouldn't I talk to the nun? And he said, because they're ghosts. And they only come to see you if they think you're going to die. So that terrified me. So there I am, I'm like medicated right to the eyeballs, lying in the dark, hearing swishing skirts and all these strange noises. And I thought I was going to die. I was petrified. But as I lay there, I began to think about all the things that I had wanted to do in my life and hadn't done. And trying to write a book was one of the things. And I decided if I get out of there alive, that's something I was going to try to do right away. I got out of the hospital, I got home. And the second day at home, I called my partner in Thailand and I sold him my shares in the business. And that same day, I started to write. And remember, I was still really medicated. So, I mean, it wasn't like a planned process. It was just something I sat down, I started to write. And a name came to me from out of nowhere, and the name was Ava Lee. And a rough plot idea came to me. And I had one sentence in my head, which sort of set the tone for what I wanted to write. And that sentence was, she didn't know where the call originated, but she was sure it was somewhere in Asia, and the caller was either ignorant about the time difference or too desperate to care. That was the line I had in my head. So I started to write. So all of a sudden I'm writing. This character comes to me absolutely fully formed. I mean, there was no pre-plotting, there was no planning. It was a very spontaneous thing I was into. And I was writing for 2 or 3 days, and I turned off all my phones in my office. And my wife came into my office and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm trying to write a book. And she said, oh, and she left. And 3 or 4 days later, she comes back and she says, you're still trying to write that book? And I said, yes. And she said, what's the book about? This is about a Chinese Canadian lesbian accountant who chases bad debts for a living. And she said, oh God, she says, can't you write about something you know? Anyway, undeterred, I kept writing. And as I'm writing this book, an idea for a second book actually comes to me while I'm writing the first. So I finished this first book, and like on a Tuesday morning, and Tuesday afternoon, I start the second book, and just right into it. And then I gave the first book to my wife to read. I never share work in progress ever. Okay, so but she got the finished book to read, and she came back to me a couple of days later and she says, you know, it's not bad. which for her was I took it as a rave. Anyway, she said, maybe you should think about getting it published. I immediately found out that there's not a publisher in Canada who wants anything to do with the writer directly. Okay. Unless your name is Penny or something like that. So they don't want you to phone them. They don't want you to send them emails. They don't want you to send them pieces of manuscript. They do nothing. What they want you to do is find an agent and let the agent winnow through all of this stuff. So, and then I found out that getting an agent is almost as hard as getting a publisher. But one of my daughters knew someone who knew someone. So I had at least that to work with. And I ended up calling, I made cold calls. And the first two calls I made, they wouldn't talk to me. The third time someone answered the phone, I think by mistake probably. And I got this agent on the phone. She says, well, what's this book about? And I said, Chinese Canadian lesbian accountant who chases bad debts for a living. And she said, well, at least it's different. She said, send me the manuscript. So I sent her the manuscript. Now, I was so ignorant about the process and I knew nothing about the publishing business or the writing business. I mean, I knew nothing. So the manuscript I sent her was single space with no page numbers. Okay. I got an email back 2 days later from her saying, could you please paginate this? And I said, I would if I knew what that meant. So anyway, so the end of that story is that 2 weeks later, the agent calls me, says, we want to talk to you. So I'm going to see the agent. And I thought it would be one of those conversations like, okay, this is a good start, but now go back. You've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Instead, I walked in and they said, we'd very much like you to sign with us, and here's a contract. So now I had an agent. And meanwhile, I'm still writing, right? I'm writing the second book. And as I'm writing it, I realize I've got plot ideas for a third book and a fourth book, okay? And so I'm just writing while all this other stuff, exterior stuff is going on. So the book is now with the agent. And about a month later, we get an offer from Random House for a 2-book deal. And my agent says, well, that's really nice, but House of Anansi Press, we promised House of Anansi Press that we would go and speak to them. No, I knew House of Anansi, but I was surprised they would want like a mystery thriller kind of book, because they have been Canada's premier literary house. I mean, that's where Margaret Atwood was first published, and so on and so on. But anyway, we go to House of Anansi for a meeting and talk about the process and the character and the books. And they had read, I'd finished the second book by then. I'd actually finished the third book by then, okay? And I was working on a fourth book. And this came out of our conversation. And the next day, House of Anansi gave us an offer gave us a 4-book deal. Okay. And in the meantime, I'm just continuing to write. I haven't stopped writing. So I got plots for 5th book, 6th book, and so on and so on. Anyway, as all of this is going on, the publishing process begins. And first part of it, of course, is editing. And I have tremendous respect for editors. And I don't have a book that has not been improved by my editors. And I've had 2 in my short career. And the editing process was nothing, it didn't go the way I expected. But my editor actually sat down with me and said, okay, look, this is a 3-step process with us, okay? The first part is called the substantive edit. And that's where we simply look at the big picture. We look at the plot. We look at character development, like big issues. Once we get past that, Then we'll go to a line edit. And the line edit is where they actually do go line by line by line by line, shifting things around, taking things out, restructuring, that kind of thing. And then the last part of it, when that's done, then it goes to a copy editor who looks at the spelling, grammar, the small stuff, right? So they had, and Nancy had bought my first 4 books, and they actually paid a lot of money for them. And so when my editor says, I'm sending you, for the first book, I'm sending you my substantive editing notes, I had no idea what to expect. And I get 6 pages of single space notes. And like honestly, the first note was change the beginning of the book, and the last note was change the ending of the book. And in between, it was, I hate this character, can't you lose him? Okay. And I like this character, can't we expand him? And can't we make this guy more of a villain? It was that kind of thing. And it shocked me at first, but as I began to think about it, I thought, well, you know what? She knows what she's doing, and it's silly for me not to listen to her. So I did what I normally do in that kind of situation. I went for a walk with my wife, and I talked it through with her. And in the process of talking it through with her, I began to change my concept of the plot. I ended up with that first book. I took the entire last half of that first draft and I threw it away. And I created a whole new story from that second half of the book. And I took characters out and put characters back in. And she absolutely loved it. So it worked well. So anyway, so now I'm going to be published, and to say I was excited is an understatement. I mean, I was just thrilled with it all. And then just before the book was to be published, there was the London Book Fair, and my House of Anansi goes to the book fair, and I'm playing golf with my brother, and my cell phone rings, and I answer. It's one of the people from House of Anansi in London to say that a Dutch publishing company had just made an offer for the books, and was this an acceptable sum of money? And I had no idea this was going to happen. And I said, of course it is. Well, within the course of that first week in London, they sold the Dutch rights, Spanish, German, Turkish, French, and one of the big publishing houses in the UK bought the English language rights for the UK, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So now all of a sudden, my books are going to be everywhere. To date, I think we've been published in 30 countries, in I think 8 languages, maybe 10 languages. But I was shocked because I had no idea that this was the way it was going to work. And then we started immediately, we were getting option offers for TV and film. And we ended up cutting a deal with a firm out of Toronto. And 1 week after we signed the deal with this outfit in Toronto, I get an email from Ridley Scott's organization saying they would like to acquire the rights to the books. And I was so shocked and depressed at the same time because I adored Ridley Scott's work. And, my office is in the basement. And if it had been up higher, I might have jumped out of a window. I was quite upset about it all. Anyway, so that's how my journey began. And it hasn't stopped. So one book has just kept leading into another. So this book here, The General Tiananmen Square, is the 15th book in the Ava Lee series. I've written another series of 4 books for my character from the Ava Lee series. His name is Uncle. So there are 4 books in that series. And I wrote a standalone novel that House of Anansi published. So that's sort of my journey. That's where I am. So I started 2011 was when the first book was published. So I've been averaging, I guess, close to 2 books a year since. So anyway, that's where I am now. I would love to answer questions and have a conversation. So if you want to open that up, I'd be pleased to participate.
I have a question. You said that Uncle grew out of Ava Lee and that you have 4 books about Uncle.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you're planning on writing any more, because he's my favorite character. I love Uncle.
Okay. Well, as you know, in the Ava Lee series, this is I guess, spoiler alert for those who haven't read the series. Uncle dies at the end of the 6th Ava Lee book.
Oh,
And,
no.
Oh, see. I guess I shouldn't have said that. But
Well, he's an older fella, so you would expect it eventually.
yeah. But it was strange because, you know, my writing process is a bit different than most, in that I've always had this story arc in my head. Okay. So like when I was writing the 3rd Ava Lee novel, I knew what was going to happen at the end of the 6th.
Wow.
Okay? And I basically written in my head the last 2 chapters of the 6th book long before I ever got to it. And so the idea came to me with certainty. Like it wasn't should he, it was he will pass. Okay. And a lot of my readers were upset by that. But it was something that I felt had to happen. And then I went to a meeting with my publisher and editor, and they said to me, why don't you write a series about Uncle? Why don't you cover his life from time as a young man to the time of his death? And what that allowed me to do was also fit in to the books a lot of like history, not as a history lesson, but it's him as part of history of the development of Hong Kong and the development of China. So the first book in the Uncle series deals with him as a young man escaping from China, fleeing Mao Zedong's crazy Great Leap Forward, when millions and millions of people starved to death in China, and they were flooding into Hong Kong as fast as they could. I think it was 1959, they estimate that 1 million people tried to escape from China to get to Hong Kong. And there was no easy path to way to do it. Basically, most of them tried to swim. There were 2 bodies of water that they could get to Hong Kong through. And the Chinese would patrol these bodies of water at night, shooting people who were in the water. So they estimated 1 million people, I think, tried it, and half of them died. So that forms part of the narrative of the first Uncle book. The second one deals with the opening up of Hong Kong with the special economic zones and the impact that had. And the last book actually deals with how the Chinese government cut a deal with the triads to be in effect a paramilitary force in Hong Kong after the handover. And so I like to mix the fiction with the facts in that sense. And I don't think there'll be any more Uncle books. I think the 4 takes us. Hard to think of going beyond that.
He's just such a wonderful character, and he has such a great arc throughout the whole series of books.
Well, one option we have, which my editor has been discussing, is between the Ava Lee prequel, The Dragonhead of Hong Kong, which shows you how Uncle and Ava first met, to the first Ava book. Is a 10-year gap. And my editor has suggested that we might go back and fill in that 10 years with more Uncle Ava stories. So that's something we're thinking about.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I'd give anything to hear more about Uncle.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much, Ian. That's a fantastic story that you have. Very inspirational. You said that you started off in journalism, and my question is, how much writing training did you have before you decided to venture in your first creative book? And throughout all of that, did you take any writing workshops, or is this just au naturel?
Working as a newspaper reporter certainly gives you a sense of structure, you know, and I was a beat reporter, so it was you'd be phoning in stories, making them up in your head as you went. So I think that was very good training. I've never taken a writing course. I've never done a workshop. I have never done anything like that. So the rest of it is au naturel, as you said.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
But one thing I do though is I like to talk my way through books and plots. Okay, so I will bore my wife and my friends when I get an idea for a story. I talk it through, and I find that something that may sound great in your mind sounds idiotic when you try to put it into words. So I find it's a good way of working through plots and working through characters.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned that a lot of history goes into your books. I was just wondering how much research if you do research, probably a lot of your histories you are like obviously already know about it because it would be quite interesting, and that's where you would go along. But I'm just curious how often you do dive into researching so that you make sure your books are as accurate, and how accurate do you think your books are? Do you keep history as history, or do you kind of sway it to what you need?
Well, when I first started to write, so my books take place in a lot of exotic locations, you know, or foreign locations, but I only write about places I've actually been to. Okay, and I'm writing about things I've seen and been part of. Okay, so there's not much research involved in that sense. Although I do have to go back sometimes to make sure that my memory is accurate, you know. But the Ava Lee books, I mean, I write about real hotels, real restaurants, okay, et cetera, et cetera. And when she's in a foreign location, again, I take great care to be accurate. But I don't want to write a travel log. So I don't want to bore my reader with detail after detail after detail. So what I tend to do is to pick on something that's different or colorful, something that made a place stick out for me, you know. For example, in the first book, she goes to Georgetown, Guyana. Okay. And everyone is fixated on potholes. And the reason for that, when I was in Georgetown, that was all people talked about. The entire country of Guyana has about 600 miles of paved roads. The entire country. And of the 600 miles, about 590 are full of potholes. Everywhere you go, there are potholes. And the papers write about it, everyone complains about it, but nothing ever happens. So in the book, I have all this stuff about potholes. The other thing I did in that book is I like to borrow or steal from people who have been in my life and people I've spoken to, have been part of stuff in a good way and a bad way. So, for example, again, when I was in Georgetown, I went down for breakfast at this hotel I was staying at, and there was a young guy sitting at a table with a Manchester United tattoo on his arm, and we were the only two people in the restaurant. He calls me over and he says, "Don't eat here." He says, "Coffee and toast, nothing else." He says, "I've been here 6 months." And he was working for the Rolls-Royce company. And it turned out Georgetown had the last power plant in the world powered by a Rolls-Royce engine and for electricity, but it only could generate enough for half of the city. So half of the city was dark Tuesday, the other half was dark Wednesday. They alternated back and forth. And I write about that in the book, and I describe him accurately. The other thing that I did was especially in the early books, I patterned a lot of the villains on people I knew, people I had, people I didn't like, people I had run-ins with business, and it was my way of sort of getting back at them. It was my way of sort of working through all of my issues, and then I would tell them they were in the book, and the reactions I get would be strange, to say the least. At times, some of them were quite pleased, you know, even if they were a villain. So,
Or are you saying they recognize themselves in there?
I tell them, I describe them accurately. I use their speech patterns, things they would say, et cetera, and you know, although my partner, I made him one of the villains in the first book, and I describe him as this fat little guy sitting on a couch. His feet don't touch the ground. He's got a bed comb over. His shirt buttons he's so fat, the buttons are pulling thing, but I had him in the book as in being involved with what in Thailand are called lady boys. And so he didn't mind any of the physical description whatsoever, but he objected to being associated with lady boys. So anyway. So don't be afraid to take real people and fit them into your books. It makes it easier in your imagination, you know. Less
So
text.
regarding the real people, do you have the standard disclaimer at the front of the book that this is all fiction?
No, we've only done that once, and we did it when we you know, I've written so many books I can hardly remember the titles anymore. It was a book about Sarawak, and we're writing about the rainforest and the destruction of the rainforest. And the guy who's the emir or whatever he is there is very litigious. So my publisher was keen to put a disclaimer at the front of that book. So we did. Otherwise,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just wondering, something that a lot of white authors are accused of when they write of another race is cultural appropriation. And I'm just wondering if you had any backlash about that.
Well, okay, so this is a really touchy subject. So in 2009, it wasn't as touchy a subject. And my editor at House of Benancy was a young Korean Canadian woman. And she found nothing objectionable in the books. But she warned me. She said, you can't expect to be accused of cultural appropriation. And the truth of the matter is, it's never happened once. I've never been criticized at all for that. But I think, and I have a very large Chinese reading base. I have great support from the lesbian community. But I think it's because perhaps that I treat them all with tremendous respect. So from a cultural viewpoint, I'm pretty accurate in terms of describing like the workings of a Chinese family. Okay. And in terms of her sexual preference, like I don't write sex scenes. I don't try to put angst or big drama into it. It's treated in the most matter-of-fact manner possible. But it is an issue. I don't think, truthfully, I don't think my books would be published today. I don't think there would be a market for them, or a market for me, an old heterosexual male, you know. It would be, I think it'd be very difficult to find a publisher.
Thank you.
Hi there. You said that your villains are mostly based on other people. So does that mean that your heroes are more based on yourself?
Well, consider who my hero is. No. So anyway, I've been asked at the beginning, I was often asked, how the heck did you come up with the character Ava Lee? Right? And my answer was, I don't know. She was just there. Okay. And as I said, at the time, I was just out of hospital. I'm medicated. Oh, I lost you. Oh. I'm medicated, and this thing happens spontaneously to me. Later, I'm at an event, and a woman comes up to me and says, you have to stop giving the answer that you don't know, because you probably do know if you stop to take the time to think about it. She said, what you're doing is subconsciously channeling all kinds of stuff. So you're channeling all of your years in business experience. You're channeling all the years you spent traveling all over the world. You have, you know, I have tremendous respect for women, and always my entire life I've been surrounded by strong women. My love of Chinese culture and history. When I worked for 20 years in Asia back and forth, and I was always reading about places where I was working. I was always trying to understand the culture, understand the people. I had Chinese friends. I went to Chinese funerals, Chinese weddings. So, and I saw the inner workings of Chinese families. So I was absorbing all of this. And so then subconsciously she says, this is how it all came out. And I said to her, well, then why did I make her lesbian? And she said, because you never want another man to sleep with her. And I thought that's a great answer. So that's the answer I've been giving since.
Wanted to wait and see if other people had questions before I popped in with a second. I'm just curious, how long does it take you usually to complete like a first draft, and then the editing process? Like, what's the blocks of time that you spend on a book?
I've slowed down, Tracy. I wrote the first 4 novels in 8 months. Okay. But I had the story arc, right? And I was having as much fun as I've ever had in my life. You know, I was just in heaven, and I just didn't want to stop. So I was writing every day, and now I can probably 3 months, 4 months easily. Okay. But I'm a constant rewriter. So I start off every day rewriting what I wrote the day before. Okay. Because when I go to bed, I'm thinking about it, and I'm making changes in my head. And again, this is part of my weakness, is because I'm not doing a lot of pre-plotting or planning. Okay. I'm always having to go back and fix things because things change as I go, right? But so I'll start every day by rewriting what I wrote the day before. and then move forward. Another thing I do is I never stop writing at the end of a chapter. I like to end my day in the middle of something where I know how I'm going to start the next day. Okay. I just fall right into it again. Right. But I would say 3 to 4 months to write a novel. Then if I put it aside, I've got 3 or 4 people I trust as my first readers. So I'll ship off the manuscript to them, starting with my wife. And I take their comments and I may go back and rework. And then it goes to my editor. And the editor usually sits on it for 2 or 3 months. Then he'll come back with his notes and back to rewriting again. So I fell into a one book a year cycle with Ava Lee, but I was writing Uncle at the same time, so I was going back and forth. So it was 2 books a year. So that's sort of been my schedule all along. Right now I've started, I think, a new series that I'm going to enjoy writing. And I'm about 3/4 of the way through, but I'm taking my time with it.
Just had a sort of a comment. I read once that William Faulkner said that he wrote Sound of the Fury in 6 weeks. And people called it the tour de force. And he said, really, I had that story written long before I sat down to write it, because he went over it so many times in his head, and he had it all worked out before he even sat down to write it.
Yeah.
I just wondered if it was something like that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, like I said, I was writing the 3rd book. I knew how the 6th book was going to end. Yeah. I had that story arc, and I'll tell you, from doing events and meeting with other writers, nearly everyone's different. You know, like a Terry Fallis, for example. Terry pre-plots meticulously. I mean, he'll write 80 pages of notes before he even sits down to write a book. I can't do that. Okay. I like the spontaneity of it. I like starting a book, being not quite sure. I mean, I know I'll start a book as long as I know how it's going to end. The fun for me is figuring out how to get there. Okay. Adding characters, changing characters, and not being afraid to go with things. Okay. Some of the best advice I was given was, when you're writing the book and you come across, and you're writing about a character who bores you, get rid of them. Okay. If you start writing about a character you really enjoy, run with them, go with them, build on them. An example, I was writing a book called The Goddess of Yantai, which is an Ava Lee novel. And in it, Ava her lover is Pang Fei, is a famous Chinese film actress, who was married to a director by the name of Lao Lao. Okay, and they're divorced. And Lao Lao is now a complete wreck of a human being. Okay, he's a drunk, he's drugs, he's gay, his life's a mess, and he's ruined. And so in the book, my initial idea was Ava had to meet with Lao Lao to get some information to help her girlfriend. Okay, this Lao Lao character grabs a hold of me. Okay, and he fascinates me, and I can see, and in my head, I'm thinking Ava is going to try to save this guy, rehabilitate this guy. So he went, that character Lao Lao went from being a character in one scene in the one book into becoming a major character in the next 3 books. Okay. And that was simply because he's grabbed me. He grabbed me and I ran with him. Okay. So don't be afraid to do that, you know. And as I said, the same, I'm writing with some characters, they bore the heck out of me. I get rid of them.
I have a question. Ian, you had mentioned earlier, and I'm sorry I missed the very beginning because I couldn't get on the call, but I came in sort of at a point where you said you had like a 4-book deal and you had been you said you got paid, you know, a lot of money. And I come from the world of visual art, and often when you sell a piece of art, it's public knowledge because, you know, this piece costs $20,000 and this piece costs $10 million if you're Ian Hurst. I have no idea what people make as writers, and I suppose it's an incredibly varied thing because you can be a junior writer who makes whatever, and you can be a well-established writer who can make, you know, or you can be a star writer like Stephen King. I'm just wondering, I'm so curious about what writers make, like in terms of book deals. And
at the top end, they could make a lot of money. Like a Jan Martel, for example, if he hasn't made 15 to 20 million from A Life of Pi, I'd be shocked. Okay. Pre-Life of Pi, I was told that he'd never made more than 25,000 a year. And he was writing full time. Okay. So he hit the jackpot with The Life of Pi. And that's often what happens. You get one book that takes off and you know, you need it, and it has to be published internationally. Like a bestseller in Canada, it's probably no more than 5,000 or 6,000 copies, maybe 10,000 copies. Okay. And an author, I mean, in terms of royalties, the standard rate is 8%. Goes to the author of a sale of a paper book. If it's a ebook, it's 25%. So just do the math. If you're making, you know, book sells for $30 and you're going to get you $2 a copy, sells 5,000 copies, you get $10,000 coming in. That's it, you know. So it's tough. You don't get rich in Canada being a writer, believe me. You need to get the international exposure to make it happen. And then you can luck into TV film option deals, which also can pay well, especially if something actually happens with them. The Ava Lee books were optioned right from first year, and the people who optioned them had the right to renew, and they kept renewing. So I kept getting paid, but they did nothing with them in terms of actually turning out a TV series or film. So last year was the first year it was our choice whether they could renew or not. And we told them we weren't renewing. So right now my agent we're in the middle of negotiations right now, as a matter of fact, to try to turn Ava into a TV series.
thanks. That is very interesting. Yeah. The
I mean,
possibilities and the different.
I mean, I'm sure we all start off, we're not writing for the money. We're writing because we have to write, right? It's something within us, something we love to do. And the money is always secondary, I think, when you start out, just the idea of being able to create something.
Do you have long sort of dry patches and like where you're not motivated, and do you let those pass, or do you really fight it and scratch and crawl and try to get a little bit done every day?
I've never had a long dry patch. I won't say I write every day, but I probably write 6 days out of 7. I don't have a schedule. So I don't have a word count I'm trying to reach. I just write when I want, the way I want, as much as I want. If I want to write, if I feel like 1 page, I'll write up 1 page. If it's 10 pages, it's 10 pages. But I sit down every day. I'm writing something. And even if it's crappy, even if you're stuck and you don't like what you're writing, I think it's important to keep going. Just write your way through it. You can always go back and fix things, right? You can always go back and improve things, which is part of my process. As I said, I'm always going back and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And if you're not doing, like, it's hard to sit down. I couldn't anyway, and write a first draft without heavily editing it myself, and without a lot of rewriting. So yeah, but every day. So even if you're stuck, don't get just write, You have to force your way through it, I think. I mean, and people get discouraged, so I meet a lot of people who they've written 120 pages and they stuck because they don't like where they are. And my advice always is just finish, just finish, because you can always go back and improve and fix and amend, okay? But you need something to work with, okay? So I find people are too hard on themselves.
So I had a question, Ian.
Yeah.
Do you write from the beginning to the end, or do you jump all over the place?
That's a very good question. I start at page 1 and go to the last page in order. I do not jump all over the place ever. But writers do that. I know writers who do that. Okay. It makes me crazy. Because I can't do it. But there are people who do it. And I say that because some of them are my friends. And I've been sitting in a room with them, and I'll say, well, what are you working on? It's just, oh, I'm working on the middle of this book. I said, well, where's the beginning? I haven't done that yet, No, I started to be I one right to the end. I like that flow. Yeah.
Here's Neil again.
Yeah, that was actually kind of my question, because I'm beginning to try to put the pastiche of my life together in a memoir format. But like, my life is a long series of vignettes, and it doesn't make sense to me to do it chronologically. But what I'm finding is, like, I'm all over the place. Like, it's just, I think I'm going to get a giant whiteboard and like a detective novel, start sticking things up so that I can visually see all the different places that I want to go with it, but I can't in my head keep it all kind of cohesified that way. So to hear you say that you start at the beginning and go to the end, I guess I really don't have a question for you, because I don't even know how to do that. So,
well, I know, but everyone's different. I took Terry Follis likes everything all laid out, and I've had done events with other writers, some of whom use whiteboards, believe it or not. Okay, they got all the characters on the board, they got everything laid out, where the plot lines are all there, so they've always got it as a reference point. I can't. I don't do that. But I was doing an event with one of them, and he was talking about that was his process. And I said, I've got a great plot idea for you. Okay. You're a writer who does all this in the whiteboard. But every morning when you come down to your office, it's all changed. Someone's been changing it mysteriously in the middle of the night. Anyway, whatever works for you, go with it. Okay. I mean, there is no one way to do this right. Okay. So if you need a whiteboard, do the whiteboard. Okay. But, and if you're writing vignettes, what does it matter where you start or end? Right? Because they're like really individual little stories, correct?
I'm Shirley. I'm the one you've been corresponding with.
Oh, hi, Shirley. Yeah.
I really appreciate your talk. I'm one of those that bounces around between plot lines.
Yeah.
Mostly because I never know where the beginning is and the end is. That this was fascinating. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All I can say is keep at it. Don't get discouraged. Don't listen to anyone else. You know, write what you want to write the way you want to write it. And that's the best way of ensuring that whatever you end up with is somewhat original, you know.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day down there.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank you very
off.
much for joining.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.